Hey you guys, Matt Allen here. Welcome back to Tactical Bassin'. Today we're talking about where bass go after they spawn and how to catch them. When bass are spawning, things are easy, right? Fish are pushing into the backs of pockets. They're in obvious places. You can just look at a map and know where to go fishing. But what about after the spawn? What about when these fish start transitioning towards summer? That post-spawn period, it's a whole different animal. You can get on fish and then all of a sudden, poof, they're just gone. That can be really disconcerting for a lot of anglers. It can be frustrating. It can leave you scratching your head. But if you get ahead of it, it can be one of the most fun periods of the year. The post-spawn opens up all sorts of doors because the bass split, and that split is what causes a lot of the confusion for anglers. After bass spawn, half of them, actually I would argue it's less than half, but a lot of them will stay shallow, and then this big chunk will go out to deep water. The majority of the biggest fish seem to head towards the deep water, but make no mistake, there are still absolute giants that will stay shallow, and they'll stay there through the summer. You've got to decide which group of fish you want to focus on any given day or on any given lake, because they're very, very different groups of fish. But where they're going, how they're behaving, the first thing you've got to understand is which group you are after, because that will dictate a lot of things for you. Now, the type of lake that you're on will, of course, make some huge adjustments as well. But generally speaking, some fish stay shallow, some fish go deep. The fish that are shallow are easier to target, especially if you're shore bound. You have a small boat, you're not, maybe you're in a kayak, you're not covering huge amounts of water. Those shallow fish are easier to target. Personally, I think that in most situations, they're the most fun to target as well, because they tend to stick to cover. So the fish that are shallow, post-spawn, they sort of spend a week or two in recovery after the spawn, and then they start feeding again. Once you've found those fish, I mean, you can just have a ball. There's a lot of different ways to catch them depending on the type of fishery you're on. We're going to circle back to that in just a second. But those shallow fish, just know that they orient to cover, whereas deeper water fish, which may mean offshore fish, it may just mean deeper water fish, depending on your lake. We'll get to that too. Those fish tend to orient around hard structure, i.e. rock, just hard bottom as opposed to mud. They'll get on sand. They just get on hard surfaces that they can hold to. And that can be humps, island tops, just points. It can be a lot of different things. Again, we'll get to that too. But understanding which group you're after, you can already see, makes a huge difference in where you should be fishing. So let's talk about the types of lakes first. In a lowland reservoir, typically we've got lowland reservoirs, highland reservoirs, natural lakes, and rivers or lakes with a lot of current. That pretty much sums up the entire country. Most ponds fall into the natural lake category if you're a pond guy. Unless your pond is steep and deep with a big dam on it, then you're probably more like a highland reservoir, okay? Fish will be in different places in all of those. So the first thing you have to do is figure out what type of fishery you are on, along with, do you want to go for the shallow ones or the deep ones, okay? Lowland reservoir. In a lowland reservoir, typically, if you don't know what that is, a lowland reservoir has a dam on it. It often has more than one dam, because lowland reservoirs are shallower areas that have still been dammed up. So it might take a couple dams to hold them. It might take one really wide dam to hold it. But as a whole, that lake is going to have a lot of contours out in open water, not so many of those big long finger creek channels that have 500 points in them. Highland reservoirs, they tend to have a narrow dam. They're very deep, steep walls, canyon type lakes, and they tend to have those long fingers with little arms going off of them. Lots of secondary points. Natural lake speaks for itself. I'm on a natural lake right now. Giant, flat, expansive, slow rolls to deep water. These can be challenging. They can, and we'll come back to that as well. And then last is going to be those fisheries, either a true river or a river that's been dammed up, but it still has tons of current flow through it. So let's start with the lowland type reservoirs. And I've got a bunch of baits for you too. We'll talk baits towards the end, specific baits that I rely on, that Tim relies on. We've built confidence through the years to target fish in those certain environments. But let's first talk about where they'll be in those different scenarios. So in a lowland reservoir, the shallow fish, man, they're fun in those fisheries. They're spread out though, because lowland reservoirs will tend to have a lot of contour. So not the long deep creek arms. It'll just be, you know, meandering creek, humps on both sides, long tapering points, things like that. Big humps. Those fisheries, if they've got a lot of brush and grass in them, man, you can have a ball. Fish will be all over that stuff. The biggest issue there is you've got so much cover, it's identifying where in that cover they are. And what I like to look for is I take the areas where I know they were spawning, or if I don't know where they were spawning, I look at the map and I take the biggest points and the biggest bays. And then I go to those areas and I look for the closest cover, i.e. grass, heavy vegetation, brush in the water, laid down trees, anything like that, actual cover. Docks are a huge one. So if you've got a big spawning bay and there's docks coming out of there, this fish will be on that stuff. And that's where I start. That's my starting point. Let's just stick with the shallow thing for a second. So in a lowland with a lot of cover, that's where they're going to be. In a lowland that's more sterile, sometimes you've just got a lake that doesn't have a lot of grass in it. It's even easier. They're going to pull to the only cover. If there's docks, they'll be on the docks. They'll be on the pilings in the shade. Shade is critical. They'll be up under, oh, fish just blew up right here. They'll be tucked up under any bush that's laying on the water, any lay down that's into the water. They'll be on that cover. If there's none of that, but there's shallow boulders, they'll tuck right up against them, sit in the shade against those big rocks. And those fish are very easy to target. In a highland reservoir, so steeper, deeper canyon style lake, typically clearer, but not always, it's really easy because the vast majority of spawning takes place in the backs of these long arms. And that's typically the only area where you've got an excess of cover. So you go way back in the cove and you get to the very back and you've got grass or brush or wood, whatever, and those fish will stay right there. I mean, they don't leave at all. They spawned and 10 feet away is where they're sitting waiting for summertime. It's really easy to target those fish. In a natural lake, well, now it's a big bear, right? We've got so many miles of shallow cover. What I look for in this situation is outer edges. Once the fish are done spawning, they'll stay in that cover, the shallow ones will, but they'll pull to the outer edge, the farthest out edge of the cover. So if there's a outside grass line, they'll be there, and conversely, they will also be on the farthest in. So I literally am fishing the extremes in a place like this. I'll fish the farthest out cover and I'll fish the shallowest back of coves. You know, if there's a canal, I'll go to the very, very, very back. They tend to be in one of those two places. Now, Are there fish everywhere in between? Of course there are. But what I'm trying to teach you guys is how to develop a pattern that will be consistent and you can run it. You can go try to figure out how to catch them in between, but that's not going to be something where you can jump spot to spot to spot to spot and know that they're going to be there. And that's what we want to do. We want to identify these key places where I know I can look at the map and already see where fish are going to be, so I'm not wasting time. And then in a river, rivers are a little different, right? There are still going to be shallow fish, there'll still be some deeper fish, but if we're talking a little creek, they're all sort of together. If we're talking a big river, they'll be split. Some fish will stay in the backwaters. And again, they'll be right on the cover. All right, now fish that go deep. Deep is sort of a different animal. Let's run them in the same order of events, okay? Because I know that each of you are on a different style of fishery and that little bit of information is really important for you. So for a guy on a lowland reservoir, fish that go deep, typically that's fish pulling offshore because you've got slower contours, so those fish move out. The places that I'm going to look at are the farthest out humps, or the farthest out you can go before it breaks to deep water. So the end of a long tapering point, or if there's a series of humps, the outermost hump. And it's the outside edge of the outermost hump. Typically, the closest you can get to the main river channel without actually falling into it. They'll be on those points or those humps along that. Now, we've learned from live sonar that there are fish that are just going to be floating. They're very difficult to catch without it, except that we've been doing it for years. We have talked to you guys for years about color lines, fishing the color line in the post-spawn and the summer, and that's literally targeting those suspended fish that were relatively untouched until live sonar came along. What I mean by the color line is if you get to the outer edge of a point, when you look up shallow, that water, it's sort of brown, right? You can sort of see bottom through it. And as you get out to the deep water, it turns blue. Right there where it makes the shift from one color to the other, we call that the color line. There's nothing there. It's just the depth where the sun is no longer penetrating and hitting bottom, okay? That magical line, you can follow the color line on a lake, and that color line, depending on how clear your lake is, might be in 7 feet of water, 20 feet off the bank. It might be in 60 feet of water, 200 yards off the bank. But you can see it with your eyeballs. And once you've identified that color line, you can fish that contour, because fish will suspend on a color line and they'll hunt towards the surface. So again, if you have live on your boat, that has shortened that learning curve. People can pull up on a point, scan out, and see whether or not there's fish there. But if you don't feel left behind. We've been doing this forever without it. Pull up on your color line and just follow that general contour around a point or around the outer rim of a hump and cast in the open water, and you will call those fish up. And we'll get to baits in a minute. Same exact thing goes for a Highland reservoir. It just tends to be closer to shore because the contours are steeper. So fish will suspend on outside points, outside humps. They'll also get down on the bottom. They're not all suspended, but it's going to be the rocky points. The points that have hard rock, hard bottom, those are the places that we're going to focus our time. Not that they're not in other places, but that's a pattern that you can build and you can follow, and you'll consistently catch fish. Natural lakes, fish that go out, they are roamers. It's difficult. It typically takes a pinch point in a lake. So like maybe you've got two opposing points and it's narrower there than in the rest of the lake. The fish will sit off of those points. Even if there's nothing there, they'll sit there. But if people have come along and put brush piles, or if, you know, a dock has blown down or a log has gotten pulled out to deep water, if there's anything solid out there, solid objects, rock piles, logs, brush piles, anything like that, it's like a magnet to those fish. They are on that stuff. And then river fish, they are living on current seams at that point. They don't have to be near the bank at all, but they'll be sitting on current seams where there's fast water running by them, but there's some sort of current break, and they can sit in that eddy and feed. Now, as far as how we target these fish, I'm not even going to break it down by Highland versus Lowland, all that. I'm just going to break it down as if your lake has a lot of vegetation in it, so a lot of grass, a lot of stuff to get caught up in, or if it doesn't, if it's more sterile. We'll base our baits on that. And I've got, you know, before we even get to that, I'm gonna throw you one oddball because it matters right now. Right after the bass spawn, the shad spawn. And that shad spawn, it can go by and you'll never even know it because it happens first thing in the morning. First thing, right at first light. And it won't last very long. It might last 15 minutes. It might last 30 minutes. It might last an hour if you've got cloud cover. But bass will get up and push the shad. The shad will be up spawning, and they tend to spawn up against hard banks. Shallow, hard banks. They'll be right on grass edges if that's all they've got, that hard edge. But the bass will just tear them up. And this is the time of year where it is worth getting out of bed early just to see if you've got a shad spawn going on. This is one of my favorite times of year to throw a spinnerbait. Flat out, I love spinnerbait fishing on the shad spawn. And I don't care if it's a Highland Reservoir, Lowland Reservoir, natural lake, don't care. If there's shad in there, they spawn just after the bass, and you need to get out there and check. Take a spinnerbait, they'll eat other things, but take a spinnerbait, throw it right up against cover or dirt shallow on the bank and just wind that thing. You'll see them chasing the shad in the morning. That is such a fun technique. I wanted to make sure I touch on that because some of you missed it this morning. You need to get on the water tomorrow morning and just check that pattern. I mean, it's happening now in a lot of the country. Let's back up to baits though. As we go into the post spawn, and again, post spawn, in some places, bass are just beginning to come in. I understand that. In other places, you know, South Florida, they're way done, way done. They're middle of summer. We get that. So these baits will help carry you through. First one's going to be a topwater. If you've got a lake with less vegetation, it's going to be a walking bait or a popper. And I'll link the exact baits for you guys in the video description. I'll even give you favorite colors. Like this is a color we reviewed recently. That's a new Mega Bass edition. Unreal color for this time of year. I love that bright, bold flash. Just, I have confidence in it personally. But a walking bait and a popper are such a deadly 1-2 punch. If you've got more vegetation, then a lot of times you don't have the option. I'll still try to throw a walking bait, especially on the outer edges of grass, but up on the stuff, in the cover, throwing it in the grass, on the mats, into bushes, it's going to be a frog. Typically with the frog, I'm focusing on a bluegill type color. You notice that same orange shot on that popper? Because bass love to target bluegill this time of year. They're both in the shallows, and there's just a little bit of a war that goes on between them. By little bit, I mean a giant war. So topwater is a major player. You just need to adapt the type of topwater to where you're fishing. Next is going to be an underspin. Okay, slow rolling a swim bait is a huge thing. Be that a big swim bait or a little paddle tail, but adding a blade to it makes all the difference this time of year. Because again, shad are spawning, bass are chasing them. Spinnerbait's amazing, so is an underspin. And then even when that spawn is over and that shad get out deeper, especially on Highland Reservoirs, you'll see them at like, they'll suspend like 10 to 30 foot. The bass will be smashing them. That blade is what makes your swim bait stand out from the crowd. It makes all the difference in the world. I just don't even bother throwing a bare swim bait most of the time this time of year. It's always an underspin. Less vegetation, this is our tactical underspin. Most of you are familiar with this. We built this because we saw flaws in a lot of what was on the market. We wanted heavy wire hooks that weren't too big. We wanted dropper arms that were long enough to allow us to throw all sorts of different baits without being too long and causing the thing to run funny. So we built the tactical underspin with intention. That's what I throw if I can, if the vegetation's not too thick. But if the vegetation is thick, I'm immediately switching to an owner flashy swimmer. That flashy swimmer is a weedless presentation. Typically the baits I'm going to pair with these, Largo shad and swammer. And again, I'll link it in the video description. I'll give you my favorite colors for each, all that stuff. The third one, and we're going in no particular order here, right? We just went from a top water to a mid to deep bait. Next one, deep bait, is going to be a deep crank. After the spawn, I go hard into that deep crank, but not like 10XDs or a Z-Boss 22 or a 24 or a 25, not that big. More those mid cranks to deep cranks. In a fishery with more cover, fisheries that have more stain in the water, they're less finessey. I'm gonna lean towards the more aggressive baits. So like a Strike King 6XD is gonna be a really good option. The Nomad is a really good option in the smaller size. The Strike King 6XD has some super bold colors. It is a proven fish catcher, very aggressive bait. Same with the Nomad. It's unbelievably loud. But overall, it's a small profile with great colors. It just has a huge presence in the water because of the sound. Those baits work really well in those lakes that are less finessey. If it's more finessey, I tend to throw our crank, the Tactical DD75. Tim and I have said from day one, we built this to be a cold water crankbait. The fact that it catches warm water bass is a happy accident. That was never our intention, but it does. It catches them really good. So if you're in a Highland Reservoir, clear water situation, a place where those bright, bold colors just don't seem to do it, that crank, it smashes them. It's a really good option, but cranking post-spawn, bass will pull out, they'll set on cover, they'll suspend. Either way, those outside fish are very vulnerable to a crankbait. Burn, 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 pause. Burn, 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 pause. We are absolutely speed cranking in the post-spawn, just like we do in the wintertime, and it flat gets those fish. Next one, going back towards the shallows. It's going to be a soft jerkbait. How I rig it and the specific baits varies again with whether I feel like it's finessier and has less cover, or if there's more cover, the fish are a little more aggressive. That's how I decide on my rigging. So two for you. I fell in love with this bait last year. The X-Zone Whiplash Shad. It's a larger profiled soft jerkbait. It's bigger than like a Zoom Super Fluke. It has this very snaky action. So like a Super Fluke, when I twitch a Super Fluke, it darts really hard. When I twitch a Whiplash Shad, it like swims and glides. It is such a unique action. It is such an overlooked bait. For a full-size soft jerkbait, hands down, that has become my favorite bait. I completely replaced my staple baits. That bait is unreal. Now, I typically am going to fish that around cover, and I'm gonna throw it on like a Gamakatsu Superline type hook. So a wide gap EWG type hook, weedless rigging, 12-pound line at a minimum, typically 15 to 17, fishing it around cover. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got that Zoom Super Fluke. And then we've got the rigging that we use when that water's clear and there's not cover. They will pound a soft jerkbait in open water if you know how to rig it. You have to go to light line. If you throw 20 pound in open water, in water that's got 25 feet of visibility, generally the fish won't touch it. But you can take that exact same bait and we nose hook it. We take an owner CPS spring, we screw it into that nose of the bait until it disappears. So we've got other videos on how to do this. Screw it all the way in until it disappears. Then take a finesse wide gap and you hook through the nose of the fluke, through the spring, and out the top of the nose. And it's just a nose hook. It's like the banjo minnow, basically. Right on the tip of the nose. And you can throw that on 6 pounds, 7 pound, 8 pounds. You can throw it on a spinning rod, and it works so well. It'll convert fish. They love that action, right? The way that flukes or soft jerkbaits flow in the water and dart and move, it'll pull fish up, but they see that heavy line, they see that big hook, they just won't eat it. But you go to that nose hook, they crush that thing. It is so effective in the post spawn all the way into summer. And then the last bait that you're gonna see me throw is going to be, I mean, we haven't even talked yet. Well, actually, you know what? I've got one more after this one. It's gonna be a true bottom contact bait, like a slow fishing bait. And if I could only have one, it's definitely a Shaky Head. The Shaky Head gets them. You guys know how much we like that net bait T-Mac, right? You can throw Bama bug, you can throw June bug, but I'll tell you what, there's something about that purple bait in the summertime. My confidence goes sky high on this. Like, I can take this to 80% of the lakes in the country and blast them on it in May, June, July. It just works. The only times I feel like it doesn't work is if the fish are really finessey. So again, Highland Reservoir, crystal clear water. That's the point where it stops working. But if you've got any murkiness in the water at all, less than 8 feet of visibility, all the way down to mud, that June bug worm is just so deadly. You can slow fish it. You can fish it down rocky points. You can fish it through brush piles. You can fish it around docks. You know, the only other thing that really plays is if we're really talking shallow water, is going to be like a Senko or like a Yama Tanuki, a weedless bait that you can let fall and pop back up, let fall again. That really works well on docks. Probably outfishes a Shaky Head in a lot of situations, but if I could only have one, it's a Shaky. And then last but not least, one more bait to wrap it up. Those deeper fish that are out there sitting on bottom. There is one bait that stands above all others for me for just covering water, just grinding, bouncing along the bottom, getting those fish to react. And that is the Wobble Head. The Wobble Head is so overlooked, so few anglers throw it, and it's such a big deal. We will do, at some point in the near future, we'll do a dedicated Wobble Head video for you, because it is, and we'll probably do a dedicated topwater video, maybe a dedicated soft jerkbait video. I don't know. We'll do a lot of stuff to help you with these key categories, but we want to give you a head start right now. That Wobble Head, and if I could only have one color, it's June bug. Again, I throw a lot of natural colors, green pumpkins, green pumpkin red, green pumpkin blue, but if I want a big bite, it's always June bug. They just, I don't know, post spawn, when the bass pull out and they set up and they start to recover, I can take a Wobble Head and I fish it just like a crankbait. I throw it out, I let it hit the bottom, and then I just start winding. And I want it bumping bottom periodically. I want that thing dancing along the bottom. If the bottom is really rocky, all the better. It'll just dance and skip and move and just roll through that stuff. If it's a super smooth bottom, I occasionally pop the rod tip just to sort of help it get a little bit of action. But it's incredible how well that works and how many people overlook it. Guys, post spawn can be an amazing time of year. I just covered a ton of different situations on a ton of different fisheries with a ton of different baits, and I know that. But I'll try and organize it in the video description for you, because really all we're talking about is throwing topwaters, underspin, deep crank, soft jerk bait, a bottom contact bait or two. I mean, it's not a lot. You just need to decide what kind of fishery you're on, so you're looking at the right group of baits. And then we've already talked about the specific areas to target those fish. And this will last all the way into summer. Guys, I hope that gives you a head start. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and we'll talk to you soon.